Okay, welcome back to our unit on oceanography or oceans. Today we're going to discuss salinity and tides. Okay, so you'll understand how much salt is in the ocean, essentially, the amount of dissolved salt in the oceans, and you'll understand the tides and what causes them and the difference between, hopefully, neap tides, okay, and spring tides. Here we go. So for your quick write, where do you think the salt in the oceans come from? Where do you think the tides are caused from? Why do you think people can float in the Great Salt Lake? Okay, that is your quick write. Okay, here we go. All right, so in seawater, the most abundant elements are sodium and chlorine. Okay, sodium and chlorine form together to make a mineral called halite, or table salt, if you will, to season our food. Where does all that salt come from? Well, over thousands of years, okay, salts are on Earth, are on the land. The rivers dissolve them and carry them down, okay, and carry them down to the ocean. So rivers essentially carry the salts to the ocean. And over millions of years, those salts have accumulated over time, okay? So salinity is the measure of the amount of solids dissolved in seawater. So look at water here. If we had 1,000 grams of seawater, 965.6 grams of it would just be pure water, 3.5% salt. And of that, most of it is chlorine and sodium chloride, or table salt, okay? But notice, okay, of that 3.5% salt, there's a lot of other stuff in here. There's magnesium, sulfate, other minerals, calcium, bicarbonate, potassium, okay? So you can see there's other stuff in there. And so we have 96.5, seawater is 96.5% water and 3.5% salt, okay? So if you were to boil water, salty water, only the water molecules would evaporate, leaving behind the salt, creating a saltier mixture. Well, something like this occurs in a lot of the tropic areas in the world's ocean. So the highest rates of evaporation occur in the tropics. Look over here. The red zone is where we get the most evaporation. Therefore, salinity, or the saltiest waters, right off the coast of Africa. And guess what forms there? Hurricanes form there. All that evaporation feeds hurricanes. The trade winds blow the hurricanes our direction to Florida, okay, and the southeastern United States. So as a result, though, tropical water, oceans contain the saltiest water, okay, salty right off the coast of here, okay, salty here. So the saltiest water in the oceans can be found near the tropic areas because of high evaporation. So what is salinity of ocean water? Okay, go ahead and write the question on your left-hand side of your notes. Write the answer on the right-hand side, please. And, okay, use the answer bank, as always, to complete the sentences here. Okay, go ahead and pause this while you write. I'm going to move on. Okay, ocean water density. What do you think affects ocean water density? How cold the water is? Perhaps how salty the water is? Well, actually the answer is both. Water becomes more dense, heavier, as it becomes colder. Okay? Water also becomes more dense, heavier, as it becomes saltier, or increasing salinity. This is why people can float in the Great Salt Lake. The water is very, very, very dense. It's very, very, very salty. Okay, so it's even more saltier than the oceans, which make it very dense. So the saltier the water, the more dense it is. And the colder the water, the more dense it is. Okay? So, what factors affect ocean water density? Okay, as always, question on the left-hand side, answer on the right-hand side. Use the answer bank to determine which words best complete the sentence. Go ahead and pause this while you write. I'm going to move on. All right, so tides. If you've ever visited tide pools at the beach, you know the best time to go is at low tide, right? You can see all the sea anemones and the crabs and the kelp and all that good stuff. Okay, so you got to go at low tide. But you might have noticed while you were there, the tide may have risen or even maybe gotten lower while you were there. Okay, so you may have noticed the tide change, rise and fall while visiting the beach. We call this rise and fall of sea level we call it a tides. Okay? The tide is actually one gravitational huge wave. So look at the moon here. This is, if you could see gravity, okay, if we could see the moon's gravitational pull, okay, this is what it might look like. It would pull the ocean as a bulge, okay? So the moon's gravitational pull causes a massive bulge or wave that pulls on the ocean as it orbits the Earth. Okay? So as the crest of the wave approaches the shore, what kind of tide do you think we get? So as this approaches the shore here, what kind of tide are we getting? Okay, that's right, probably a high tide, right? And as that crest leaves, we're getting a low tide here. Okay, so the high tide essentially follows the moon's gravitational pull. Let's investigate this further. So the moon exerts a gravitational pull on Earth. Okay, we're going to exaggerate this with a bulge with high tide on one side directly under the moon and on the opposite side of the moon. Okay, notice where high tide and low tides are. Okay, so we have high tide here, opposite side of the moon, and high tide directly under the moon. And then we have low tides, okay, perpendicular at 90 degrees to the moon. Okay, so, and as you know, the moon does what? It goes around the Earth. Okay, so these bulges follow the moon as it orbits the Earth, the high tide. Okay, so the moon goes around, and the high tide follows it, right? And the low tide does too. Okay, so this is one way we get our tides. Okay, now let's say you're here. All right, reading a nice book on the beach, right? So you're here at the beach near Florida here. So what type of tide are you experiencing? Okay, right now you're experiencing a high tide. Okay, let's say it's a really good book and you're there 6 hours later. Okay, and what type of tide are you experiencing now? Okay, a low tide. All right, so, and let's say the book is just, you can't put it down, you're there for another 6 hours, and once again, you would see another high tide. Okay, so that's essentially what creates our tides. Okay, so the gravitational pull of the moon. Okay, and now you're experiencing low tide. Okay, so now here's the thing. All right, the sun actually exerts a small gravitational pull along with the moon. So when the moon and the sun are aligned, you get the combined gravitational pull of both the moon and the sun. So they're both pulling on the tides. Okay, and as a result, we get the highest tides when we call these spring tides, when the moon, earth, and sun are aligned. So we call these spring tides. Spring tides, you get the highest tides, and you get the lowest tides as well. So these are like extreme tides, right? When the moon and the sun are aligned. The highest and the lowest tides. Whoops, let me go back here. Okay. When the moon, earth, and sun are at right angles or perpendicular to one another, we get smaller tidal changes occur, and we call these tides neap tides. Okay, so neap tides when the moon, earth, and sun are at right angles. Be careful because there's going to be a diagram like this on the test. All right, spring tides, notice they're aligned. Okay, they're both pulling on the ocean here, the sun and the moon. And then we'll go back over here, neap tides, right? Okay, and back to big spring tides. Okay, so if you ever go online and you look at the tides for like San Francisco, here's what you'll see. Notice something. Spring tide, neap low tide, spring high tide, and a spring low tide. Notice it's a very low tide here. Okay, so if you go to San Francisco, because remember, the tides are a wave, and this shows a wave, right? Okay, so a wave that represents tides. When is the high tide? When is the low tide? See if you can look at the times here and find out. Okay, so what are tides and how are they formed? Question on the left-hand side, answer on the right-hand side. As always, okay, use the answer bank to determine which words best complete the sentence. Okay, so please put a little thought into this. Okay, there's going to be a tide diagram on the test. Okay, go ahead and pause this while you write. Okay, I'm going to move on. Okay, So summarize, you can always do your own, but you can do mine here, draw some pictures and describe what type, try to determine which type of high tide is occurring above. And draw the picture below. And once again, write a sentence that describes the tide that's occurring in this diagram. Okay, so go ahead and pause this while you do your summary, okay, for 20 easy points. All right, go ahead and pause this. We'll see you next time for Ocean Notes.